Okay. Sjáumst. Metabolic testing. Today we're going to Greenfit to do VO2 max and metabolic analysis, and it's going to be interesting to see how much the system has changed in the last maybe 2 or 3 months. So we'll see. Time will tell. Arrived at Greenfit, and now it's time for testing. So, arrived at Greenfit, just waiting for the KORR metabolic cart to warm up. We'll be putting a mask over my face in this measurement, measuring both the O2 and the CO2 coming from each breath, and contrasting that with the atmosphere around us gives us what we call a metabolic pattern. So I can see how much fat, how much carbohydrates I'm burning, and therefore I can derive the thresholds based on that. It's some time since I did this metabolic assessment on the run, so it's going to be interesting to see how this will pan out. But I'll also be using what we call a Moxy, which I'm going to put on my thigh, and that's going to measure the oxygen saturation as well as the hemoglobin concentration in my muscles. So that's going to be a useful metric to look at afterwards as well. So just a few minutes more and then we can start. Now, freeze that frame. There are always these moments right after these tests where you think, oh gosh, I should have done more. And at this moment in time, I'm thinking, Siggy, you absolute wimp. Why didn't you do 1 minute more? But all jokes aside, this was a really good test,
And now let's head to the analysis and see what we can do with the results and where we can improve. Okay, so now let's go over the results and what we can see from the test, where my limitations lie and where I can improve, specific of course to the races I'm going to be doing this summer. On the first figure we're going to look at, we see the VO2 versus the VCO2. So VO2 blue line here, VCO2 is the well, you can say the orange or the brown. When I do these measurements as a standard, I tend to be in a fasted state in the morning. This is just to have them as standardized as I can, because meals can have a huge impact on your metabolic profile. And when I do these baseline tests, I just want to have the same kind of a reference value all the time. So this could be a little bit different if I were not fasted, and then we'd see probably a little bit higher CO2 in my breath, as I would be burning more carbohydrates. Red line is the heart rate, and as you can see, people always ask, what's your VO2 max? I'm reaching about 80 in this test, and this is just one number that goes into performance, but it's not the only number that is going to define how you're going to do in races. So VO2 max is important, but it's not the absolute thing that's going to define if you're going to do well or not. So my number is close to 80 on the run as I'm in this state today, but it has gone up since February by about 3 points. So I was 77 then, and it's gone up to 80 now with the, I've been doing some speed work and some interval sessions to raise that. Yeah, so this is just basically what we're looking at to start with. So a really good baseline there. And then it's always good to see from the gas exchange how I'm using fatty acids and the carbohydrates as a fuel source. Your body can use fats and carbohydrates. Looking at this, we can draw a line roughly here where we can see the fat oxidation at its peak. And this is essentially what would define my, most people go by the zone 2. So this is the upper limit of my zone 2 heart rate. And essentially 80% of my training is going to be done below this point. So slower than about 128 heart rate. Then we can draw another line here. And this is essentially where you can see the carbohydrates, the gray line. They tend to go skyrocket a little bit here. While the fatty acid goes, pretty dramatically down. And this is essentially zone 5 if you're using the 5-zone model, but we could also be using a 3-zone model like I can show you afterwards. If I were measuring lactate, like you can see here, it would probably behave something like this. If you haven't checked out my lactate video on the bike, I recommend you do that. But otherwise, this is essentially what we would be seeing if we would be taking lactate. So it would go down a little bit in the beginning, then it would be stable up until the point where we see the fat oxidation rates start to drop. Then the lactate goes up a little bit. And when we see it, the carbohydrates skyrocket here, the lactate shoots up. Lactate is essentially a byproduct of a carbohydrate metabolism. So when you break down the sugars in your muscles, you always produce a little bit of lactate. However, the muscles you're using, they can always use this lactate to some extent until you reach a point where the production is just too high, and then it just shoots upwards. But yeah, it tends to follow, in a way, this metabolic profile of the carbohydrates and the fat. So this is like kind of how the interplay between lactate and metabolism comes into play. And we can probably do some measurements in the future where we do these measurements side by side. It's really interesting to see that. So again, if we look at these 3 areas in the 3-zone model, I tend to simplify things into 3 zones. I just conceptually in my mind, I like to look at that, as just everything that is below 128 heart rate for me, where my fat oxidation rates are at the highest. This is just zone 1. It's just easy training. So basically 80% of what I do is going to be there. I'm going to be spending minimal time at this point now in this zone 2, but I'm going to be at, probably just the crossover point between zone 2 and zone 3 in this model for my next few weeks, because my main races now in the middle of summer are going to be Olympic distances. That's going to be involving a 10-kilometer run, which is, run close to threshold or even a little bit above. So my race intensity there is going to be here. However, when, the summer progresses, we're going to be focusing on the Ironman event. Then the load is going to transition a little bit more into this zone 2 here, because that's really the race intensity that we're going to be focusing on. In the end, this is really where I lack as an athlete, and this is where I need to improve if I want to maintain as high performance as I can when I'm at the higher intensities, because I have a high VO2 max, but what I really lack is the efficiencies to be able to sustain a high oxygen consumption for a very long time. And this is essentially coming down to my breathing patterns. So as you can see on the lower figure here, this is my tidal volume. So it's essentially each breath, how deep can I breathe? I can maintain about 6 liters at the beginning, and then it starts to drop a little bit. It goes, a little bit down, 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 and then when I hit, this is essentially the same point where we saw the carbohydrates start to shoot up. It drops pretty dramatically from about 4 liters down to less than 2. So I have 8-liter lungs. So when I'm breathing less than 2 liters each breath, that's a pretty crappy breathing, to be honest. That's less than 25% of my total capacity. And so this is really where I need to improve. And we can also see this here with regards to the oxygen saturation in the muscle and the hemoglobin. When the hemoglobin shoots up like this, it's an indication that carbon dioxide is starting to build up a little bit. There is this thing that is called the Haldane and the Bohr effect. I'm not going to go into details of that here, which will explain this phenomenon here. But you can Google it if you want, for those of you who are really thirsty for some extra knowledge. But may be interesting to do a video on that sometime later. But that is related to how my breathing patterns are at a higher intensity. So I just need to focus on these things. I need to train at this specific intensity, the borderline between zone 2 and 3, or zone 4 and 5, if you will. This is about close to 160 heart rate. So for the next few weeks, my interval sessions are going to be based on that. I'm going to be putting myself in that intensity where my heart rate goes up to about 160 beats per minute. This should be about the 320, 325 per kilometer as a pace on a flat surface. And sustaining that for doing 5 times 2 kilometers at that tempo. Focusing on the breathing and trying to increase the efficiency at this point. So that's all I have today. If you have any questions, please just comment beneath, and I'll see you in the next one.